My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 39, and the last time my family saw me cry was at my father's funeral, 12 years ago. That was also the day they decided I would never amount to much. Tonight, sitting in the Chicago federal courthouse, watching my sister's husband on trial for federal racketeering charges, I finally understood what power really felt like. The courthouse towered above the city like a monument to judgment. Inside, the marble walls and high ceilings seemed designed to make anyone who entered feel small. I sat in the third row of the gallery, wearing a plain navy blazer over slacks, my dark brown hair pulled into the same practical bun I'd worn for years. To anyone watching, I could have been just another concerned relative, maybe a paralegal or a court reporter. My sister, Melissa, sat 2 rows ahead, her blonde hair perfectly styled, one hand gripping our mother's arm. Mom wore the string of pearls that had given her on their 25th anniversary, glancing back at me every few minutes with that same look of quiet disappointment she'd worn at every holiday dinner since I dropped out of law school at 23. At least Rachel showed up, I heard her whisper to Melissa. Not like she has much else going on. The words slid under my skin, finding the same old bruise that had never really healed. I'd heard it all before. Rachel's the failure. Rachel couldn't finish anything. Rachel still hasn't figured herself out. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that for the last 21 months I'd been the lead undercover officer in Operation Iron Harbor, a joint task force between the Chicago PD, ATF, and U.S. Marshals. While they thought I was bouncing between low-level police assignments, I'd been living under a false identity inside one of the most dangerous organized crime groups in the Midwest, gathering evidence on arms trafficking, drug distribution, and political corruption. And Ethan Callahan, Melissa's charming, successful husband with his logistics consulting firm, had been my primary target for almost 2 years. Melissa had married him at a lavish ceremony in downtown Chicago 5 years ago, making sure everyone knew I was the unmarried sister as still working for the police. I'd stood quietly in the corner that night, letting everyone believe I was just another beat cop writing traffic tickets, not the officer whose work put her in the crosshairs of some of the most violent men in the country. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Sandra O'Neill, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with a reputation for zero tolerance toward organized crime, presided. Ethan sat at the defense table, flanked by his expensive legal team. He looked calm, maybe even smug, as though this was all some big misunderstanding that would be resolved by lunchtime. The assistant U.S. attorney, Veronica Chen, rose for her opening statement. My pulse picked up. I'd spent months feeding her information through official channels, watching her assemble an airtight case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as she began, her voice firm, this case is about betrayal of the law, of the public's trust, and of the oath every citizen takes when they choose to live in this country. The defendant, Ethan James Callahan, used his business as a cover to traffic illegal firearms across state lines, launder millions in drug proceeds, and compromise public officials for personal gain. Melissa's knuckles whitened around Mom's arm. I caught the almost imperceptible tightening in Ethan's jaw. For the first time, he seemed to realize this wasn't going away. Chen laid out the charges with precision: wiretaps, financial records, surveillance footage, all tying him to shipments of military-grade weapons bound for gangs in Detroit and St. Louis. Then she said it. And the most damning evidence comes from an undercover officer who spent nearly 2 years embedded in the defendant's network. That officer is in this courtroom today. The gallery went silent. Melissa glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning faces. She had no idea she was looking right past me. The first witness walked in with the kind of calm that makes liars sweat. Captain Daniel Ruiz of the Chicago Police Department took the stand in a charcoal suit that still couldn't hide the squared shoulders of a beat cop. He'd been my commanding officer since I was a rookie, the one who taught me how to keep my voice steady while my heart tried to pound its way out of my ribs. Captain Ruiz, the Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen said, Please state your role in Operation Iron Harbor." I supervised the Chicago component of a joint task force with ATF and the U.S. Marshals, Ruiz replied. Our primary objectives were to infiltrate a weapons trafficking pipeline and identify the financial structure supporting it. "And was an undercover officer placed inside the network connected to the defendant, Ethan Callahan?" "Yes." Melissa sat up a little straighter. Mom looked confused, then wary, the way she did when the dinner check arrived and she wasn't sure Dad had brought the right card. "Is that undercover officer present in the courtroom today?" Chen asked. "Yes." Ruiz didn't move for a heartbeat. Then he turned his head and looked straight at me. Every sound fell out of the room. The shuffling papers, the throat clearing, even the fluorescent hum seemed to mute. I stood, because there was nothing else to do, and the jurors blinked like they were watching a magic trick. 2 rows ahead, Melissa's hand dropped from Mom's arm. Mom's pearls clicked softly as her fingers flew to her throat. "Officer Rachel Morgan, CPD, Ruiz said. Undercover operative assigned to Iron Harbor for 21 months. Ethan's face finally changed. The composure cracked. A shadow ran across his expression like a cloud covering sun. I had seen that look before, right after a sting goes loud, when men who thought they were kings realized the crown was borrowed. Judge O'Neill's gaze fixed on me. "Officer Morgan, you'll be testifying?" "Yes, Your Honor." My voice carried farther than I expected. Maybe the courtroom wanted to hear it. "Approach," the judge said. Walking the aisle felt longer than any wire I'd worn or meat I'd survived in a warehouse that smelled like oil and ghosts. I handed the clerk my shield and department ID. Behind me, pens scratched, whispered headlines grew legs. "Quiet Sister a Cop." "Sister-in-law the Snare." "Chicago puts a bow on Iron Harbor." Chen began clean and surgical. "Officer Morgan, describe your cover." I operated as Ray Monroe, a freelance logistics broker with access to warehouse space near Cicero and a trucking contact who could move unmanifested pallets after hours. I built credibility with small runs, untaxed cigarettes, counterfeit handbags, then graduated to moving crate lots I knew ATF had already tagged. "Your relationship to the defendant?" I was introduced to Mr. Callahan through an intermediary at a West Loop private club. After 3 meetings and 2 test runs, he began routing sensitive shipments through me, using a shell importer called Silver Bluff Trading. I documented each exchange per protocol. Chen displayed the first photo, me, in a grey ball cap and a windbreaker, standing beside a stack of plastic-wrapped crates. The timestamp glowed yellow in the corner. Juror 4 leaned in. "What were in those crates?" Chen asked. "Lower receivers and conversion parts, destined for gang distributors in Detroit. 2 pallets of ammunition concealed under spare auto parts." "Who approved the movement?" "Mr. Callahan did," I said, and the screen changed to a text thread that had kept me awake more nights than coffee. "Ray, we're green. Same dock, midnight. No chatter. His number. His phrasing. His recklessness." From the defense table, Ethan whispered something to his attorney. The attorney shook his head very slowly. Chen moved to the second prong, the money. Officer Morgan, did you also document the financial laundering associated with these shipments? Yes. Funds were split between a crypto mixer and a chain of restaurant fronts in Indiana. The consulting invoices were written by a firm on Lake Street, owned by the defendant's holding company. I prepared ledger reconstructions and provided them to the task force accountants. Another slide. Bank statements with black rectangles over account numbers and bright circles around the deposits that didn't belong. I remembered the night I pulled those statements out of a printer while pretending the toner had jammed. I remembered my hands shaking for exactly 5 seconds in a bathroom stall, then not at all. Chen gave me space to breathe before she went for the heart of it. Officer Morgan, what risks did you face maintaining your cover? I thought of a parking lot in Gary, Indiana, the skin burn of winter through a thin jacket, a man with a serpentine tattoo laughing as he checked the false bottom of a crate. I thought of a birthday cake with my name written wrong, Ray, in icing, because criminals celebrate, too. There were weapons at every meet, EI said. There were moments when discovery would have meant immediate harm. The team managed those risks with trackers, surveillance, and quick reaction units staged nearby. But undercover work always carries risk. Melissa made a small sound, half gasp, half denial. Mom didn't move at all. Defense finally stood. The lead attorney smoothed his tie like that could even out the day. Officer Morgan, you're the defendant's sister-in-law. Isn't it true your testimony is colored by a personal grudge? No, EI said. It's colored by evidence. Weren't you dismissed from law school? Perhaps there's resentment toward your family's higher achievers? I withdrew from law school and became a police officer. The evidence stands regardless of my resume. He tried a different angle. Isn't it also true that you ingratiated yourself socially with Mr. Callahan's family to gain proximity and advantage? I let the question hang. I attended mandatory family events. If proximity were my goal, I would have chosen quieter rooms and friendlier tables. A thin ripple of laughter moved through the gallery before the judge cut it with a look. Nothing further, a defense said, defeated early but smart enough to stop digging. At recess, the hallway filled with murmurs and the bitter coffee scent of courthouse vending. Melissa reached me first, mascara trembling. You were pretending? At Thanksgiving? At my wedding anniversary? All those times you sat there saying nothing? I was working, EI said. And I wasn't allowed to tell you. How could you do this to us? Her voice splintered on the last word. Ethan did this to you, EI said gently. I documented it. Mom stood a few feet back, clutching the purse she treated like a life raft. You could have found another way, she whispered. Something less deceptive. The word landed with the dull thud of an old bruise. I took a breath, counted 3 beats the way Ruiz taught me. Undercover work is deception with guardrails, EI said. It's also the reason no one got shot when those crates rolled east. Her mouth pressed into a line, but the certainty in her eyes faltered. Captain Ruiz appeared beside us like a lighthouse in a storm. You did good up there, Morgan, he said simply, nodding to my mother and sister with a courtesy that made me ache. We're on in 10. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon belonged to recordings. My voice, flattened by wires, bargaining for delivery windows. Ethan's voice, low and self-satisfied, approving routes and blurring lines. Each clip was a brick stacking into a wall the jury could not climb over. The defense objected again, objected a third time, and each time Judge O'Neill said, "He overruled," like a gavel in a metronome. By 4 o'clock, the gallery's attention had the sharp edge of a storm front. Reporters scribbled, a sketch artist's charcoal moved in quick, decisive strokes. When Judge O'Neill finally recessed for the day, Ethan didn't look back at us. He stared dead ahead, perhaps at the version of his life that had just been cancelled. Outside, Lake Michigan threw grey light across the city. On the courthouse steps, Melissa hovered as if the ground had shifted and she didn't trust her feet. "I don't know who you are," she said. "I'm your sister," I said. "And I'm a police officer." "That's not the same as family." "It's how I protected family," I answered, though I wasn't sure she heard me. My phone buzzed. A text from ATF Special Agent Jules Park. "Clean work. Tomorrow we run the Detroit branch. Be ready." Another from Captain Ruiz. "Early call. Dress warm. Rooftop brief. 0700. I tucked the phone away and lifted my face into the cold. The city smelled like snow and exhaust and second chances. I had spent almost 2 years being invisible on purpose. Now there was nothing left to hide behind, only the work, the evidence, and whatever pieces of family could survive the truth. Tomorrow I would testify again. Tomorrow we would play the tapes that no one who loved Melissa should ever have to hear. And tomorrow, if the weather and the warrants cooperated, the task force would walk into a warehouse on the Calumet River and end the last run Ethan ever arranged. I tightened my coat and started down the steps. The marble behind me held echoes I didn't need anymore. Ahead, squad lights blinked a quiet rhythm in the Chicago dusk, and I followed them into the night. The next morning started before the sun even thought about showing itself. I stood on the rooftop of a CPD tactical building, the wind coming off Lake Michigan slicing through my jacket. Captain Ruiz was already there, coffee in one hand, binoculars in the other, scanning the dark outline of warehouses along the Calumet River. "You ready for this, Morgan?" he asked without looking at me. As ready as I was the first day I walked into that club pretending to be Ray Monroe, I said. Ruiz smirked. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're gonna get." At 0700 sharp, our joint task force gathered in a loose semicircle, CPD, ATF, US Marshals, even a couple of FBI agents who'd flown in from Detroit. On the screen behind us, a drone feed showed Ethan Callahan's last operational hub, a squat warehouse with rusted siding and a single roll-up door that looked like it hadn't worked since the 90s. "This is it," Ruiz said. "Callahan's network runs out of road today. Detroit crew's expecting a shipment tonight, 20 crates. But our intel says Ethan moved up the schedule. They'll start loading in 2 hours." I glanced at the grainy live feed. A dark SUV idled by the side entrance. 2 men in heavy coats stepped out, scanning the lot like they'd read the same manual as us. "We're splitting into 3 teams," Ruiz continued. "Entry, perimeter, and intercept. Morgan, you're with me on entry. You know the layout better than anyone." Of course I did. I'd been inside that warehouse more times than I could count, sometimes dropping off tagged shipments, sometimes pretending to fix a forklift while memorizing escape routes. We moved in position by 0800. The sky had that iron grey light Chicago gets before snow, muting everything into shades of cold. My comm crackled. "Alpha team in place," ATF's Jules Park reported. "No movement on the south side." Copy, Ruiz said. Stand by for breach. 2 minutes later, the signal came, a short buzz in my earpiece. Ruiz kicked the side door with the force of someone who'd been waiting a long time for this moment. The metal groaned and gave way. We swept in fast, flashlights cutting through dust and oil fumes. I moved toward the office space where Ethan usually handled the ledger work. Instead of the chaos I expected, there was only one man inside, hunched over desk, a cigarette burning low in his fingers. He looked up, startled. Not Ethan. One of his lieutenants, name was Gary, but everyone called him a tire iron for reasons I never wanted confirmed. Police! I shouted. Hands where I can see 'em. Gary's eyes darted toward the filing cabinet. Bad idea. I closed the distance, shoved him face first against the wall, cuffed him before Ruiz even stepped through the doorway. Where's Callahan? Ruiz barked. Gary smiled with a mouth that had too many missing pieces. Not here. Outside, the sound of shouting and boots on concrete told me the other teams were busy. The radio lit up, a package secured. 2 vehicles intercepted. Multiple in custody. I found Ethan in the loading bay, flanked by 2 of our guys in tactical vests. His hands were zip-tied, his jaw set like he was posing for a mugshot. Officer Morgan, he said flatly, as if we were meeting for Sunday brunch instead of a felony arrest. Guess I should have invited you to the Christmas party. Guess you should have picked better friends, I shot back. Ruiz read him his rights. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't protest, just kept looking at me with that faint, infuriating smirk. The rest of the morning was paperwork and evidence tagging. Rows of crates split open to reveal rifles, pistols, and enough ammunition to start a small war. ATF's team handled the weapons. CPD catalogued documents and hard drives. I found one folder labeled Silver Bluff, personal, and slipped it into an evidence bag myself. By noon, Ethan was in the back of a CPD van headed for a federal holding facility. I stayed behind, standing in the cold as forklifts hauled out the last of the crates. Ruiz came up beside me. You did good, Morgan. Took a long time to get here. Yeah, I said, watching my breath cloud in the air. But we got here. Back at the courthouse that afternoon, the trial rolled on like we'd never left. The jury now had fresh evidence, photos of the seizure, serial numbers matched to stolen shipments, and, thanks to my undercover work, recorded conversations where Ethan casually discussed routes and payoffs. Defense tried to object to the new exhibits. Judge O'Neill cut them down in 2 sentences. The evidence is admissible. Proceed. When I took the stand again, Chen guided me through each piece like laying bricks into a wall. I spoke clearly, evenly, dates, times, locations. No drama, no wasted words. Just the truth. By the time court adjourned, Melissa was gone from her seat. Mom lingered in the aisle, looking like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't make it easier for her. Outside, the evening wind had picked up, carrying the sharp bite of lake air. My phone buzzed with a message from Jules. Detroit warehouse secured. Clean sweep. Nice work, Ray. I allowed myself one deep breath of satisfaction. Iron Harbor was finished. But the trial, my real test, was still in full swing. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the fresh evidence, or maybe it was just me, walking in with the memory of Ethan in zip ties still playing on a loop. Whatever it was, the air in Judge O'Neill's courtroom had the charge of a storm about to break. Chen was already in her seat, flipping through a stack of exhibits. She gave me a brief nod, her version of a pep talk. Across the aisle, Ethan's defense team huddled, their expressions sharp and calculated. Ethan sat between them, calm again, as if the warehouse bust had been a minor inconvenience. "Officer Morgan," Judge O'Neill said once court resumed, "you may retake the stand." I settled in, adjusted the microphone, and felt the jurors' eyes on me. They weren't just curious now, they were invested. They'd heard the tapes. They'd seen the photos. They wanted to know what came next. Chen started by recapping the operation, moving through the chain of custody for the seized weapons, then looping back to my undercover role. Her questions were crisp, each one setting the stage for the defense's counterattack. When she finished, the lead defense attorney, Martin Keeler, stood. He was tall, lean, with the kind of courtroom voice that could talk you into buying the Brooklyn Bridge. And he came at me hard. "Officer Morgan, you've testified that you infiltrated Mr. Callahan's organization under the name Ray Monroe, correct?" "Yes." "You deceived everyone you met during that assignment?" "That's the nature of undercover work." He paced slowly in front of the jury box, like he was building a rhythm. "And that deception extended to your own family?" "Yes." "You sat at their dinner table, celebrated birthdays, all while secretly gathering evidence against Mr. Callahan?" "I did my job." "Your job." He let the words hang in the air, then turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are asked to believe this witness acted without bias, without personal vendetta, when she infiltrated her sister's marriage. But isn't it true, Officer Morgan, that you've had long-standing tensions with your family? That you've been treated, by your own account, as a disappointment?" I kept my gaze steady. "My personal history doesn't change the facts of this case." "Doesn't it? You could have recused yourself, passed the operation to another officer, avoided any conflict of interest. No one else had the access I did. No one else could have gotten as close without raising suspicion." Keeler took a step closer. "Or maybe you stayed on because this was personal." "Or maybe," I said, leaning slightly toward the MIC, "I stayed on because the man sitting next to you was trafficking illegal weapons into cities already drowning in violence, and stopping him was worth whatever my family thought of me." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe respect, passed over Keeler's face. He regrouped, shifted tactics. "You expect this jury to trust your testimony when you've admitted to lying for nearly 2 years?" "Yes," I said. "Because every lie I told led to the truth sitting in those evidence boxes." He opened his mouth for another question, but Judge O'Neill cut in. "Move along, Counselor. We're not retrying the concept of undercover work here." The rest of his cross-examination was more of the same, needling at my credibility, trying to paint me as reckless or vindictive. But the jurors weren't buying it. I could see it in the way they leaned back when he pressed too hard, in the way they nodded slightly when I answered without flinching. When Keeler finally sat down, Chen rose again for redirect. "Officer Morgan, in your time undercover, did you ever plant evidence against the defendant?" "No." "Did you ever fabricate conversations or falsify reports?" "No." "Did you document all interactions according to department protocol?" "Yes." Chen gave a small, satisfied smile. No further questions. Court adjourned for lunch. I made it halfway down the hallway before I heard my mother's voice. Rachel. She stood near the windows, hands clasped like she was holding herself together. Melissa was beside her, eyes rimmed red. For a second, none of us spoke. You could have told us, a mom finally said. I shook my head. You know I couldn't. Her gaze wavered. I don't mean about the case. I mean, about you. About what you really do. I thought about the years of holiday dinners where I was the quiet one in the corner, the one they assumed had nothing to contribute. You never asked, I said. That's not fair. It's exactly fair. You didn't want to know. You liked your version of me better. Melissa flinched. We just didn't think that I was capable of this. I said that I was willing to risk my life to take down someone you invited into our family. The silence stretched. People brushed past us on their way to lunch, the hum of courthouse chatter filling the space between us. Mom finally said, we didn't see you. Not really. It wasn't an apology. But it was closer than anything I'd heard in years. I have to go, I said. Court resumes in 30 minutes. As I walked away, I heard Melissa whisper to Mom, what if she's the reason Ethan goes to prison? And Mom, her voice low but clear, said, then she's the reason he can't hurt anyone else. By the third week of testimony, the courtroom had taken on its own rhythm. Jurors filed in like clockwork, notebooks in hand. Reporters arrived early to secure the best seats. Even the security guards had stopped checking my ID. They knew exactly who I was now. Ethan still carried himself like a man who thought he could spin his way out of anything. But the small signs were there, the way he tapped his pen against the table when a recording was played, the way his eyes narrowed whenever one of his associates took the stand and flipped on him. On Tuesday, the prosecution called its final witness, an ATF ballistics expert who linked the seized rifles to 3 separate crime scenes in Detroit, St. Louis, and Gary. The jurors leaned forward as he explained how serial numbers had been filed off, how the barrels had been altered to hide their origin, and how those exact modifications matched weapons I'd personally seen unloaded from Ethan's trucks. When Chen rested her case, the room felt heavier. We'd built something solid, brick by brick, and now it was the defense's turn to chip away at it. They tried. Over 2 days, they paraded character witnesses, former colleagues of Ethan who called him a dedicated businessman, a retired alderman who swore Ethan had done more for the community than most politicians. But under cross-examination, Chen dismantled them, revealing business deals that dissolved into lawsuits and community projects that funneled money back into Ethan's own accounts. On Thursday, the defense signaled they were done. No testimony from Ethan. No attempt to explain the texts, the bank records, the surveillance footage. Just an unspoken gamble that they'd seeded enough doubt. That night, I went home to my small apartment overlooking the river. I hadn't slept there much in the past 2 years, too many nights in safe houses, cheap motels, and borrowed couches. But sitting in my own living room, I felt the weight of the case pressing in. The trial wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about whether 2 years undercover, the lies, the close calls, the holidays spent pretending to laugh at his jokes, had been worth it. It was about whether my family would ever look at me and see more than the disappointment they'd carried around for years. Friday morning, Chen delivered her closing argument. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying through the room with a steady conviction that made even the court reporter pause. This case is about choices, as she told the jury. The defendant chose to use his business as a cover for moving weapons that have taken lives. He chose to launder money through a web of shell companies. And when he thought no one was watching, he chose to brag about how untouchable he was. But someone was watching, for nearly 2 years. Gathering evidence. Risking her safety. Doing her job so the rest of us could sleep a little easier. I kept my expression neutral, but her words landed. Keeler's closing was polished but desperate. He tried to paint Ethan as a victim of overzealous law enforcement, claimed that my undercover role had a blurred personal and professional lines to an unacceptable degree. He spoke about a family betrayal as though it outweighed illegal arms trafficking. The jury received the case at 2:17 p.m. The rest of the day was a waiting game, reporters milling in the hallway, attorneys pretending to read emails, jurors sequestered somewhere above us with coffee and stacks of evidence binders. I sat alone on a bench near the north windows, watching the city shift from afternoon light to the warm glow of evening. My phone buzzed, a message from Captain Ruiz. Whatever happens, you did your job. You did it well. By 6:30 p.m., word came down, no verdict tonight. Deliberations would continue in the morning. Outside, the February air bit through my coat as I crossed the plaza. A few reporters shouted my name, but I kept walking. Somewhere across town, Melissa was probably pacing her living room, waiting for news. Mom might be doing the same, though she'd never admit it. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every meet, every shipment, every coded text. I thought about the night in Gary when a guy with a knife in his boot had decided I was too curious about a shipment, and how close I'd come to blowing my cover. I thought about Melissa introducing Ethan at family dinners, bragging about his work with the government, while I sat there pretending not to know the truth. At 8:45 the next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number, courthouse exchange. They have a verdict, the clerk said. Be here in 30. The ride to the courthouse felt longer than any surveillance tale I'd ever done. The streets were still slick from a light snow, and every red light seemed to hold me just a second too long. By the time I cleared security, my pulse was in my ears. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tight enough to snap. The jury hadn't been gone even a full day, which usually meant one of two things. The evidence was overwhelming, or they'd made up their minds before they left yesterday. Melissa was already in her seat beside Mom, both of them dressed like they were attending a funeral. In a way, they were. I didn't look at them as I passed, taking my place behind the prosecution table. Ethan walked in a moment later, escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals. His suit was crisp, but the collar sat slightly askew, as if even the tailor couldn't keep up appearances anymore. He glanced toward the gallery, found Melissa, and gave her a small smile. She didn't return it. Judge O'Neill took her seat, her gavel a sharp crack against the wood. Bring in the jury. The door to the deliberation room opened, and 12 men and women filed in. I scanned their faces, calm, serious, unreadable. The foreman, a middle-aged man in a grey sweater vest, clutched the verdict form like it weighed more than the evidence binders combined. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Judge O'Neill asked. We have, Your Honour. The clerk took the form, unfolded it with deliberate care, and read aloud. Count 1. Conspiracy to traffic firearms across state lines. Guilty. Count 2. Money laundering. Guilty. Count 3. Possession of unregistered firearms. Guilty. Count 4. engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, guilty. The words hit like hammer blows, each one echoing in the silent room. Melissa's breath caught on the second count. Mom's hand flew to her pearls on the fourth. Ethan didn't flinch. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the table, like he'd known this moment was coming all along. Judge O'Neill thanked the jury for their service and set the sentencing date for 6 weeks out. The defendant is remanded into federal custody, as she said, and with that, 2 marshals rose to escort Ethan out. As he passed the prosecution table, he looked at me for the first time all morning. No anger, no bluster, just a slow nod, as if to say you won. I didn't nod back. The room began to empty. Reporters swarmed Chen in the aisle, throwing questions she ignored with practiced ease. Melissa stayed seated, staring at the floor. Mom stood rigid, eyes on me, something unreadable in her expression. I walked toward the side exit, wanting nothing more than the cold air outside. But halfway there, Mom stepped into my path. "Rachel," as she said quietly. "I owe you," as she trailed off, her throat working like the words were heavier than she expected. "An apology." I didn't rescue her. I never asked, as she said finally. I didn't want to know. I assumed you'd given up on yourself. But you were out there, as she shook her head. I just didn't see it. I let the silence sit. "I'm proud of you," as she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I should have said it years ago, but I am." It was what I'd wanted to hear for 2 decades, but in this hallway, after this verdict, it felt different. Like finding a letter long after the person who wrote it had moved away. "Thank you," I said simply. Melissa joined her then, still pale. "I don't know how to square any of this," as she admitted. "Ethan, he was my life, and you," as she broke off, shaking her head. "You saved people. And I didn't even know you." "You knew me," I said. "You just didn't know the whole story." For a moment, none of us spoke. The air was heavy with things that couldn't be undone. Finally, I stepped past them toward the exit. The bright winter sun off the courthouse steps was almost blinding. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking out of somewhere. I was walking into something. The Iron Harbor case was over. But the next assignment was already out there, waiting. 3 weeks after the verdict, I found myself standing outside my mother's brick townhouse in Evanston, holding a store-bought pie I didn't remember buying. The invitation had been vague: Sunday dinner, 5 p.m., just us, but the subtext was clear. This was the Olive Branch. When I stepped inside, the smell of roast chicken and rosemary wrapped around me like an old blanket. Mom was in the kitchen, fussing with the salad. Melissa sat at the table, her blonde hair pulled back, no makeup, no armor. "Hi," I said. "Hi," and Melissa echoed, her voice careful, like she was testing a word she hadn't used in years. Dinner started stiff. Mom asked about the weather. Melissa asked if I was still working nights. I told them a little about my schedule, nothing classified, but enough to make them realize my work wasn't the 9-to-5 grind they'd once imagined. Somewhere between the chicken and dessert, the conversation shifted. Mom asked how I'd first gotten into undercover work. Melissa wanted to know how I'd managed to keep my cover at family events. "It was easier than you'd think," I admitted. "Most people don't ask questions they don't want the answers to." Melissa flinched, but she didn't argue. I keep thinking about all the times Ethan made those little digs about your job, she said. All those jokes about traffic tickets and paper pushing. And you just sat there. It was good cover, I said. Nobody suspects someone they underestimate. That must have been hard, she said softly. I considered that. Sometimes. But I knew who I was, even if you didn't. After dinner, Melissa offered to walk me to my car. The air was cold but clear, the snow on the lawns untouched and glittering in the streetlights. I'm sorry, she said finally. Not just for what I said after you testified. For all of it. For never really seeing you. I stopped beside the car, looking at her. You don't have to apologize for not knowing. But you do have to decide if you want to know me now. Her eyes glistened. I do. I want to try. We stood there for another moment before she turned back toward the house. I watched her go, then slid into the driver's seat. The weeks that followed felt strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't juggling two identities. There was no Ray Monroe to slip into, no fake meetings to attend in dingy warehouses. My life was mine again, but it also felt unfamiliar, like I was living in a space I hadn't furnished yet. Work didn't slow down. The department had other cases waiting, and I was assigned to a new task force targeting a human trafficking ring moving through the Great Lakes region. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. One morning, Captain Ruiz stopped by my desk with a manila folder. Got your official commendation for Iron Harbor, he said. It's going in your file. I flipped it open, the city seal, my name, the neat summary of 2 years' worth of sweat and close calls. I should have felt proud, but what I felt was relief. Relief that it was done. That Sunday, I went back to Mom's for dinner. This time, there was less small talk and more real questions. She wanted to know about training, about how I'd learned to read people, about the safety protocols we used. Melissa asked about the chain of evidence, how we ensured nothing could be challenged in court. I told them what I could. Not everything. There would always be details they couldn't know, but enough for them to see the shape of my life in sharper focus. At one point, Mom said, it must have been lonely. It was, I admitted. But sometimes the job isn't about being comfortable. It's about making sure other people get to be. After dessert, Melissa hugged me before I left. It was quick, almost awkward, but it was more than I'd gotten from her in years. Driving back through the quiet streets, I realized something. The case had changed more than just Ethan's life. It had shifted the way my family saw me, and maybe the way I saw myself. I'd spent so long living in the shadows, content to be invisible, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be known. The recognition didn't erase the years of being dismissed, but it gave them context. They'd judged me with the information they had. Now they had more. And maybe that was enough to start over. A month after the verdict, I was back in the briefing room at CPD headquarters. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the long table cluttered with coffee cups and file folders. Captain Ruiz stood at the front, flipping through a slide deck about her next operation. The target was a human trafficking network using freight routes from Milwaukee down to Indianapolis. The kind of case that would require patience, coordination, and probably months of work before we even got close to a takedown. When the meeting ended, Ruiz caught me on my way out. Morgan, hang back a minute. I waited until the room cleared. You're our first choice for undercover, he said, leaning against the table. It won't be like Iron Harbor. No family ties, no deep cover for years on end. But it'll be dangerous in different ways. Think you up for it? Yes, I said, without hesitation. He studied me for a moment. You sure? You've barely had time to breathe since Callahan went down. I thought of the empty space in my apartment. The way the walls seemed to echo without the constant hum of an alternate identity. Breathing's overrated. Ruiz smirked. That's what I thought. You'll get your cover package by Friday. That night, I stopped by Mom's house on the way home. I hadn't planned to. I'd just been driving, and before I knew it, I was parked outside. She was in the living room, reading, but put her book down immediately when she saw me. This is a surprise, she said. I wanted to talk to you, I replied, stepping inside. She waited. I'm taking another assignment, I said. Undercover again. Different target, but it could run long. Her brow furrowed. Will it be as dangerous as the last one? In some ways, yes. In others, maybe more. She took a deep breath. Do you have to? Yes. It's what I'm good at. And it matters. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue. Then she just nodded. If you can't tell me what you're doing, I understand. But, if there's something you can share, I'd like to know. Even if it's just where you are, or that you're safe. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever gotten from her before. I'll try, I said. 2 nights later, Melissa called. We hadn't talked much since the last dinner, but she sounded nervous. I heard you're going under again, she said. Word travels fast. Mom told me. Look. I know it's not my place, but be careful, okay? I don't think I could handle another 2 years of thinking I know you, only to find out I don't. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I'll be careful. And if you ever need someone on the outside who actually knows what's going on, as she hesitated, I'd like to try being that person. The offer sat between us for a moment. It wasn't a promise she could keep in the operational sense, but it was a crack in the wall we'd built between us. On Friday, a plain manila envelope arrived at my desk. Inside was my new ID, a burner phone, and the first stage of my cover, a small trucking company out of Gary, Indiana, with a fleet of 4 semi-trailers and just enough legitimate business to hide the rest. I tucked the materials back into the envelope, feeling the familiar weight settle on my shoulders. It wasn't dread. It was focus. The thing about undercover work is that it becomes part of you. You get used to living between lines, never fully in one life or the other. It's not for everyone. But for me, it's where I've done my best work. As I left the building, I caught a glimpse of the city skyline against the winter sunset. Chicago was still Chicago, noisy, stubborn, full of contradictions, and I loved it for all of that. Somewhere out there, people were being moved like cargo, stripped of choice and freedom. And if I could stop even one truck from making it to its destination, the risks would be worth it. The night before I was due to leave for the first leg of the new assignment, I found myself driving through the quiet streets of Evanston again. The snow had started early, blanketing the sidewalks in a fresh layer of white. I could have just texted, but something told me this conversation needed to be in person. Mom opened the door before I could knock twice. You're going, she said, not as a question. I am, I said, brushing snow from my coat. She stepped aside to let me in. Melissa was in the living room, sipping tea from a mug I recognized from our childhood kitchen. She set it down and looked at me. So, this is it? You disappear again? I hesitated. I don't want it to feel like disappearing. But yeah, I'll be gone. Could be months. Melissa nodded slowly. You know, after the trial, I told myself I'd rather not know what you're doing. That way I wouldn't worry. But that didn't work. I worried anyway. Mom sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. We may not understand the details, Rachel, but we understand the stakes now. It was strange hearing that from her, strange in a way that softened something inside me. I'll send messages when I can, I said. Can't promise frequency, but you'll know I'm okay. Melissa gave a small smile. That's more than we ever got before. We didn't talk long. They knew I had an early departure. And I didn't want the goodbye to turn into some drawn-out, dramatic scene. As I stood to leave, Mom walked me to the door. You're good at what you do, she said. I wish I'd said that sooner. But I'm saying it now. I looked at her, searching for the old doubt in her eyes. It wasn't there. Thanks, I said quietly. That means more than you think. The next morning, the city was still asleep when I parked outside the CPD motor pool. My undercover vehicle, an aging Ford F-150 with Indiana plates, waited in the corner, already loaded with the bare essentials of my cover identity. Captain Ruiz met me at the door. You're good to go. First contact's in Gary, second in Lafayette. Keep your head down until we get more on the main players. Copy that, I said. He gave me a nod, the kind that said everything without words. See you on the other side, Morgan. Driving out of the city, the skyline faded in my rearview mirror. Chicago had been my battlefield for so long, its streets a map of every close call, every narrow escape. Now I was heading into new territory, with new risks and new faces. The highway stretched ahead, endless and empty. I thought about Iron Harbor, about the moment in that courtroom when my cover blew wide open, about the sound of the gavel when Ethan was convicted. I thought about Melissa's voice when she said she wanted to try knowing me for real, and Mom's quiet "I'm proud of you." For 20 years, I'd let their opinion of me sit like a verdict I couldn't appeal. But I'd been wrong. The appeal wasn't in words, it was in the work. In doing the job well enough that even people who had underestimated me couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Somewhere past Joliet, my phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. Your cover is live. Welcome to the next round. I slid the phone into the cup holder and tightened my grip on the wheel. This was the part one understood, the uncertain road ahead, the quiet calculations of risk, the patience it took to move in the shadows until the moment came to step into the light. And when that moment came, when the next courtroom was full, when the next verdict was read, I'd be ready to stand there again, knowing exactly who I was and what it cost to get there. Because this job was never about recognition. It was about protecting people who didn't even know they needed protecting. It was about doing the hard, hidden work and living with the silence that came with it. Iron Harbor had been the hardest case of my career, but it had given me something I hadn't expected, a bridge back to the people I thought I'd lost. And now, as the miles rolled under me, I knew I wasn't just chasing the next win. I was building something bigger. A life that mattered, even in the spaces no one saw.